After finishing up my thoughts on JoJolion, I really wanted to continue talking about Toru because I feel as though Toru is by far the thing that JoJolion fumbled the most, because I felt as though literally still reading the part, chapters like 107, 108, I still thought we weren't at the main villain. And there's only 110 chapters, so that's a bit sad to think about in retrospect. Overall, what I really want to talk about is what I feel are Toru's two main things that detract from him being a good JoJo villain. Personally, I would consider him the worst JoJo villain, without a doubt, because of these two aspects in the story. Obviously, this is going to contain heavy spoilers for the rest of JoJolion, since he's literally the end game villain. So, if you haven't read it, read it, come back, or if you don't care, just continue watching so you can hear me ramble about why I don't like this guy that much. So the first thing I want to bring up is his introduction into the story, because I feel as though trying to make the villain very anonymous was a good idea, and it felt very similar to things like Diavolo in part 5, where he's the head of this big organization. But the problem with this is we have not been considering the head of this organization until like halfway through the story. Diavolo was a named person who was introduced to us very early on through literally Giorno's first ever fight with Bruno. And I'm just comparing this to part 5 because I feel as though JoJolion's concept of the head of a large organization is very similar to Diavolo being the head of a large mafia organization. The idea of who the head doctor is and trying to figure out who this character actually is was what drove me to get really invested around the end game of JoJolion, and I thought it was genuinely really interesting. But something I do want to bring up is that the head doctor, we knew who they were as a concept, but we never really got to know who they are as a character. And obviously the head doctor itself was just Toru's stand and sort of a front that allowed him to get whatever he wanted, but it felt as though, same goes with Toru obviously, we never really got to know who Toru is, his motivations entirely, and I can understand why Araki chose to write them this way, but I'll get into that later. The amount of anticipation that the head doctor had throughout the entirety of the latter half of the story was pretty high, because ever since Urban Gorilla, way back when Mamazuku was first introduced, which is kind of crazy to think about, says, just wait till you get a load of our boss, essentially, because it just felt as though it was really leading up to something. But personally, I think it would have been better if that something we were leading up to was more similar to Dio in part 3 or Diavolo in part 5, where we know who they are throughout the entirety of the story. This is the person we've been looking forward to this entire time. But I get that Araki wanted to put this person in the shadows to put more highlight on Josuke, which is something I understand, but it's just not something personally I thought was compelling for the main villain of the story. Now, I want to go more into the way Toru was introduced into the story, because Toru was basically introduced at the end game when we were at the TG University Hospital. We were basically about to confront the head doctor, and he was just plopped into the scene. You know what I mean? It feels as though Araki introduced this character out of nowhere. So he was almost the red herring, which is why I believed, literally while he was getting defeated, there's still something bigger, something crazier has to happen. And even though his ability, being the Wonder Review, the head doctor, what we've been building up this whole time, I still felt that he was a red herring because of the way he was introduced into the story in such a casual, nonchalant sort of manner. The thing that we cared about the head doctor, which is very similar to Diavolo, because Diavolo was introduced with his ability. His ability, King Crimson. The head doctor was introduced with this weird, every time you try to pursue it, you will just get attacked nonchalantly, which led to the idea of Josuke having to invite Toru to attack him and sort of take him out. And it was a very weird dynamic that felt very similar as a sort of contrast to how JoJolion was progressing at that point, because many of the fights in JoJolion were long-ranged, distance automatic stance, which is just running around trying to figure out a way to attack them and not being able to do anything, essentially. Now Toru's stand, which is you can't even think about it. You can't even think of running away from it. You can't think about attacking it. If you think about attacking it, or in the case of Mitsuba literally staring at the head doctor outside, she literally started cutting off her own hands unknowingly just because she saw the head doctor. It feels as though this stand's ability is so broken that it just feels as though if you even think about it existing in any way whatsoever, or even notice it existing in any way, you will get damaged. So it feels as though it's meant to be this invincible sort of wall that has no entire just negativity around it at all. Everything else around stands and main villains usually have a character problem. Let's talk about Dio for part 3, for example. Dio's stand is super broken. He can stop time, you know, we all know this. But Dio's hubris, his pride, is what kills him, and that makes a convincing reason for him to be defeated, even though bad leg, haha, you know. But Toru, we don't even know Toru's character really whatsoever. We have no concept of who Toru is as a person, his motivations. He wants the new Rokakaka. Why? Because it's better. But why really? To make money? We don't know really. That's just something that is never really fully explained. His real motivations as a character, why he does the thing he does. And the thing that makes it so odd is the way he was introduced as this sort of red herring, which we all assumed maybe he could be important. But the way he was introduced was as Yasuo's boyfriend? And the more we learn about Toru, why did he ever do this? It doesn't really seem to make any sense in the narrative why he would go after Yasuo at all, because he's been following her ever since she was a child, and now they dated in high school and they're like ex-lovers or something. And this is obviously a spoiler thing, so I'm talking about the final chapter. Toru is shown in the flashback with Lucy and Joseph, and it's just, why was he there? I get it. They did that to show that he had the Rokakaka in the present time and that he wanted the new one. He shows some interest in this in the past, so there's some connection in the future. And it's also meant to show that the Joestar family is meant to stop the rock humans, Toru. But what is his motivation? We have no real concept of why he's doing the thing he does, and that's what's so frustrating about it, because with every other villain in JoJo, I would say, there is some form of motivation and idea as to why the characters do what they do. But with Toru, he's meant to be a sort of blank slate, and this is what I've been considering and has been annoying me quite a bit, is Araki's concept of this blank slate rock human thing. The rock humans are meant to be non-changing, they never change, which is why Toru has looked the exact same. All the rock humans look the exact same ever since they were introduced into the story or in the past. They all look the same. But for Toru, I think it's meant more to be he doesn't need to have a motivation. He'll never change. But Josuke, he'll change. And it's meant to be a sort of parallel. In the final chapter of JoJolion, Joseph actually says, this rock animal guardrail thing, it's the most hard and dry thing I've ever seen. Which is meant to obviously be a contrast to soft and wet, Josuke, rock human contrast. But all of these sort of elements feel rather forced in my opinion, because I would rather have the characters have a direct contrast with one another over the idea of them themselves. Now, the last thing that I want to bring up is something I feel really is a tragedy, which is the lack of a dynamic between Josuke and Toru. It is abysmal, personally. That contrast, when that contrast is so good, it's fantastic. It's fantastic in my opinion. That's why Dio is such a great villain. That's why Kira is such a great villain. That's why Funny Valentine is such a great villain. All of these characters have such a closely in tune contrast with the protagonist. It's fantastic. I love it. That's why I really appreciate villains in JoJo, because they're meant to show the contrast of the main character in many different ways, not just their abilities, but their personality, their worldview, their entire role in society. I think it's really interesting. And the fact that Toru is meant to be this nobody is a bit annoying. Now, I do see that obviously there is some form of contrast with their interest in the Rokakaka, where it's sort of like how I described in my original JoJolion video, where Jobin was sort of the contrast with Josuke on that. Toru also has some sort of contrast. Toru and Josuke seem to have some romantic involvement with Yasuo, but there's obviously some romantic tension, quote unquote, which is probably why he was first introduced as that, to sort of be like, oh, that's odd. I wonder why he did that. And they're both after the Rokakaka. Toru, being the head doctor, is trying to make sure that the Rokakaka can be sold for billions and billions and billions and make a ton of money, and so the rock humans can be rich forever. But again, why? This motivation feels very basic in my opinion, and as though it personally doesn't add anything to the rock human lore or anything about Toru himself that would make him more interesting. He's more just a stepping stone, pun intended, of the rock humans getting higher up in society and the humans getting lower. And I guess this is meant to be symbolic of like society and how the rock humans are the ones who are the most shallow and the least dynamic, and the least themselves are the ones who advance in society, and those who try to change don't. They kind of struggle in society. Like, I get it. Is it meant to be some heady thing? Probably, but for me, it's just not interesting, I would say. That's at least the way I interpreted a lot of it. It felt as though it was just a heady concept, and I get it. It is nice that Josuke is becoming this more open person, and I love seeing him actually feel confident in himself. I thought that was a really great way to end the story, but that being the contrast between the two feels as though it's very baseline, you know? It just feels as though Josuke and Toru should have a lot more contrast with one another, and genuinely Toru should have been built up as this sort of, if they were going to go that role of he's Yasuo's ex-boyfriend and Josuke is to watch out for that guy, you know, if they did something along that line, I would feel as though it makes sense that Toru would always have that negative sort of attribute to him, and then his reveal as the head doctor and the main villain would have been pretty interesting in my opinion. But I don't know, I feel as though that's just one way it could have been, you know, altered to make it seem as though Toru is more of an ever-present force in the story. Realistically, he has been ever-present in the story, so seeing him be revealed as a rock human and be revealed as the head doctor and be always in the past and never really changing ever, it would sort of make sense in my opinion. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Toru. I know I was incredibly negative for a lot of this, but I feel as though he was definitely one of the weakest parts of Part 8, without a doubt. Because if he was developed in a good, reasonable way, then I could see me actually sort of liking him. But there's just so many blanks about Toru that we just don't know, and it makes him rather uninteresting. And I think it's kind of ironic that many of the most basic villains in JoJo only have one name. Diavolo, one name. Cars, who is meant to be basic, one name. And now Toru, one name. Those are my thoughts on Toru. Let me know what you think of him, because obviously I am very negative towards Toru, and I don't really have a high opinion of him as a character or the concept behind him. I think he's rather but if he was written a bit different, he might have more potential in my opinion. So, curious what you all think. If you're curious about anything JoJo related of Part 8, just send questions below, obviously. I would love to just ramble and talk about the end of this now that the entire community is in a Part 8 fever now that it's finally over. I just want to get more in tune, you know. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to do the YouTube spiel, you know, like, comment, subscribe. It would mean a ton, and honestly, I feel as though I'm gonna get flamed for this. I don't know how many people like Toru, in my opinion. I don't really know. I haven't really seen much consensus on positives towards him, so just hoping, you know, this doesn't get blown up in my face. But yeah, have a good one, and hope you enjoyed.
You